Hi, I'm Dr. Marc Mednick. I'm a licensed psychologist and expert on family disputes. I've been doing this work for over 30 years, helping parents split up, doing what's best for their kids, working with entire families, trying to help them get through this very difficult time. A couple of things stick out. One is how lonely this can feel. It doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman, young or old, whether this relationship is long-term or short-term, how you got together. The point is, right now, you may feel really up against it. Most people feel like they're making this transition completely and utterly alone. Even if that's not true, that's very often how it feels. Even if you have a support system around you, you can feel like you're the only one going through this. You don't know where to turn. You don't know what to ask. You don't know what the answers are that you're looking for. When you remove someone who's been your other half of your life, it leaves this chasm, especially if you're both responsible for kids that you're creating together. Everybody's in the middle of this messy time. You're not sure what to do with your kids. You're not sure how they're going to react. You're not sure how to handle this thing called a divorce. So that's why I decided to create this podcast. We're calling it Make Sense of the Mess. Each episode, we're going to take on a different question, some big conundrum that you face as a co-parent, some very important issues that you must handle in the early stages of a divorce. And we're going to break down those questions with the hope that you'll walk away with some better handholds. Specifically 4 C's: clarity, courage, context, and community to work through this very messy time. So here is how it's going to work. In each episode, we're going to take on some new topic, something that is timely for you, something that is really urgent and necessary for you to attend to, that you need some answers with. How are we going to do that? We're going to invite some real-life people who are going through what you're going through. We're also going to invite some experts in the field to discuss kind of the best things to do, say, not say. And together, we're going to really plumb the depths of these issues so that you get a much better handle on what to do and how to do it. So this is not something you're going to go through alone. You're going to have us to take with you along the way. Buckle up and join us. So glad you found this show. Together, let's make sense of the mess. In this episode, we're going to talk about common myths about the effects of divorce on children. I'd like to begin by reimagining that question, because we tend to have a very narrow way of asking it about this question about the effect of divorce on children. Usually the question is simply, isn't divorce always traumatic to the children? Well, a really better question for your particular situation is the effect of a divorce less traumatic to the children than the effect of staying? That's really what you're weighing here, is it not? I mean, let's be honest. You're always deciding what the effects are to stay or to go, the relative effects, that is. So first, let's talk about what the research says about the effects of divorce on children. Let's talk about the short-term consequences of a divorce, that critical first year where children are adapting to this big change in their life. It's real common for kids, particularly younger kids, to have lower grades as they adapt to this changing family landscape. It's also probable that their grades return or even exceed previous levels, especially if they no longer have to deal with intense parental conflict each day. This is a really important point. People assume that the worst is going to happen, that grades are falling off a cliff, and I'm getting comments from the teacher about the child being distracted and they can't focus and they can't pay attention. And your response as a parent may be, oh, woe is me, and to feel terribly guilty and say to yourself, what have I done to my child? I've now ruined their life. Well, no, you haven't. They're adapting to a big change. What the research tells us is that most kids respond really well during that year. So by the end of that first year, they're back to where they were and their grades are even better. And even their social adaptation returns. Why is this important to talk about? Well, so that you don't have this sense of terrible guilt, but also because your kids are resilient. What makes them resilient? It's the absence of conflict. Now, I must say, all bets are off if there's a lot of fighting that continues to happen in and around the child's life and they are privy to it. If they hear you on the phone screaming and shouting or crying in your room, or if they're hearing argument between you and the other parent, then we're talking about something else. All things being equal, if we're just talking about the effects of divorce short-term on children that first year, kids rebound pretty well in the absence of terrific conflict. They do very well. Let's talk about some short-term effects on teenagers. Teens are a bit different. They're going to react differently than younger kids. Younger kids may be confused or scared or anxious. You're not going to see that as much in your teenager. What you're going to see with your teenager is more withdrawal. They may express more anger. They may be more sullen, crabby. They may feel embarrassment, huge embarrassment that their parents are going through this thing and it's ruining their life. That's what they'll say, by the way. Don't be surprised if you hear that from your teenager. You're ruining my life. How could you do this to me? It's a real rough time for them. So they don't know really how to react. Keep in mind that this time in their life is kind of self-centered. They're looking at their own lives. They're interested in their relationship with their peers. They're interested in looking outward. They don't want to be bothered by all this conflict. So this is really rough. Kids of that age don't like going back and forth between two homes. They want their own space. They want to stay in their own space. Sometimes it doesn't matter to them which home that's in, as long as they're left alone and as long as they can have that as their primary space. They're happy. Most older kids want to be helpful to their younger siblings. In some families, as you know, that's not true. That may be in yours too. It may be they may really resent having to take care of the younger kids. So you'll see a variety of responses here that are short-term. Some kids jump in and they lend a helping hand, and the risk there is that they get burned out from acting like another parent really fast. Other kids refuse to help. This is your mess. You created it. I don't want anything to do with it. You guys handle it. I'm out of here. I'm not going to deal with any of this stuff. Whereas the younger kid may have some active reunion fantasy about mom and dad getting back together. Not so the teenagers. Teenagers kind of have a sense about what the conflict is, at least most of the time. And they just want to be out of it. They want peace in their life. They don't want to know about your personal problems. They don't want to hear you relying on them as their confidant. They don't want to know. Some kids seem to want to know, and they seem to want to be involved in all this, but that ends pretty quickly. They burn out rather fast. I like to use the example of a rubber band that's stretching and stretching and stretching until you've stretched it too far, and then it just snaps. That's unfortunately what happens to a lot of teenagers here. They're resilient to a point, and after that, they'll just shut down. They have no resources to do this. So what do you do as a parent when you're confronted with this? What do you do? Well, here I'm going to recommend something that I think works a lot. It works on other things too, but here it's critical. So you're faced with a kid who doesn't want to talk to you. You're faced with a kid who doesn't want to discuss anything about this. You kind of have to have a captive audience. Best place to do that? Your car. Get him in the car. This is car time. You can have a conversation with them while you're going someplace. If they won't do that, try to take a walk with them. But I recommend the car. And you can ask them what's going on. And you can tell them what you've observed. Johnny, I have seen you kind of change in this. You're sullen. You're hanging out in your room. You're not talking to anybody. You're not participating in the family. What the heck is going on? Can you tell me? I think you need to be direct with your kid, as well as reassuring, saying, look, I know this is a rough time. I don't want this to be happening for you guys, but it is, and we need to make the best of it. And I need you to be a participant in this family. How are we going to do this together? You can make that invitation. That's another thing to do. You can always offer them a third party to talk to, a therapist if they'd like to. Usually most kids say, no, I'm not doing that. You go. But make the offer. Give them something that is tangible for them, which means by way of out of this, meaning how do you retreat? If they need to retreat and have their own private space, how are you going to facilitate that? How are you going to alleviate some of the responsibility for taking care of some of the younger kids? How are you going to create space for them to spend more time with their friends? How are you going to create space for them to do things that are of interest to them? It's art or dance or sports activities. What assurances will you provide them about how their schedule is not going to change and how they'll be able to continue their life as they did before this? to the best of your ability. If you can do those things, you'll keep your kid in the loop, but you have to be very assertive about this. You can't just let them retreat and let whatever internal emotions are going on with them fester. You got to be active. Guys, here's the good news. Your kids are resilient, probably a lot more than you give them credit for being. They will bounce back. Here's the thing. They'll bounce back consistent with how you bounce back. If you adapt, they will too. If you are able to resist the urge to vent your frustration, hostility, and depression, they'll be okay. If, on the other hand, you don't do that and you're in constant tension and conflict with your soon-to-be ex, that's going to be a problem for them. Let's rely on their resilience. We talked about some short-term myths. I want to talk about one specific long-term myth. Here it is. My child is going to be scarred for life. I am ruining them by getting a divorce. All is lost, and their future is going to be bleak because their parents got divorced. We have disadvantaged them, harmed them, and it's incontrovertible. That's what's going to happen. And to that I say, no, not so fast. Here's the thing. There are two considerations you must keep top of mind here. One is your personal adaptation. The second is your child's adaptation. You got to streamline this process. Think of your personal adaptation as holding the key to how well your children are going to adapt in the medium and long term. If you're depressed, overwhelmed with the demands of single parenting, if you're angry all the time, if you're venting your spleen about the other parent, if you're leaning on your children for emotional support, if you're telegraphing how hard it is for you to let them go on a visit with the other parent, I have to tell you, your kids won't adapt as well. And I know for some parents, it's hard to negotiate this notion about managing their stress and strain. And so they overcompensate. So that some people vent their spleen, okay, not so good. Others put on this positive front and they're overly upbeat. And I have to tell you, kids see that as inauthentic and it raises alarm bells for them. They understand that you're distressed. They understand distress. They don't want you to be disabled by it. That's the thing. They want to see you grow and adapt. If you pretend that you're not upset in front of them, then go into your room and then you cry and sob, I'm telling you with 100% certainty, your children as young as 4 years old know that you're in your room crying and sobbing. You can't hide that from them. You'll get the help that you need in order to adapt better, but please be authentic. I don't mean sharing your truth with them about how you feel about the other parent. You don't need to do that, and they don't need to hear it. It's not good for them to hear it. What is important is for them to catch you in the act of getting a little bit better, a little bit every day. If you can get better every day, and they can catch you being that kind of authentic, you're working hard at managing your emotions. You're working hard at managing your frustration. You're a bit more patient today than you were yesterday. That's what speaks to them. That gives them a feeling of emotional safety and security, and that carries you and them through. Let me give you an example about how to interact with your child. Let's say that you yelled at Jenny because she didn't unload the dishwasher the other day. She's 11 years old, very competent child, and she just forgot. She just drifted off after you told her to, and you snapped at her. And it's 2 days later, and she forgot again, and she catches you in the act of catching yourself. You don't snap this time. What you do instead is say, hey, Jenny, how about that dishwasher? Did you forget to unload it? And she smiles, and you smile back. It's a difference. It's a notable difference in 2 days' time. If you can do little things like that, these little transitions become extremely important to your children. They see your growth. They see you changing and adapting. This isn't about you being perfect. You don't need to be perfect. It's not necessary at all for their well-being. And here's the truth. Your kids know you're not. They want to believe that you are. They want to believe that myth. But here they need the real deal. They need the real you. The real you is being caught in the act of being a better parent and a better person each and every day. Now let's talk about the adaptability of your kids. As a divorce process moves, it often moves slower than you'd like it to. And for the kids as well, that's how they feel. Here's the thing. If your children feel that you lose sight of who they are and what they need, the risk is that they feel abandoned, and that causes them distress. Parents are often unaware of how depressed or anxious or alienated their children feel. In a divorce, children are often watching you a lot more than you think, just a bit like the example of you going into your room sobbing and crying and them knowing and you think they're not knowing. I'm telling you, they're gauging in a moment-to-moment way how much stress you can handle. It helps them measure how much stress they can handle. Many bright kids come to view their role in all of this as not burdening their already stressed out parent, so they don't express how they feel. Over time, they do it less and less because they don't want to burden you. They put on a happy face when inside they're kind of miserable. Some kids act out their sadness and frustration, others simply internalize it. Some teens of divorce may act out in ways that are not safe, like becoming too sexually active or engaging in other risky behaviors like drinking or doing drugs. Perhaps the thing that's at least known here is that your children are so good at adapting to the limits that you set. The container for their anxiety is your behavior. The container for your anxiety is your attention to the details of their life. If you continue to engage with them about how they're adapting, make time to talk to them. Spend time alone with each of your children if you can. I know that's hard. You're really pressed. You're a single parent. You don't have a lot of that time. But find ways to get to know what they're thinking, what they're feeling, and be open with them about what they'd like you to do differently. If you can ask your child questions like that, things will be pretty good in terms of their outcomes.
Okay, Dr. Marc, what is our conversation about today?
Our conversation today is about short and long-term effects of divorce on children. There's a lot of myth about that, how difficult this is for kids, what constitutes a difficult divorce, maybe even trauma for them or not. And we'll address all of that. So we'll be talking to a parent today who's had an awful lot of interesting experiences.
Yeah, she has 2 children that are very far apart in age and need very different conversations with helping deal with divorce. And I think she's extraordinary, and I think her story is extraordinary.
Yeah, it's been interesting and difficult. Those would be the 2 words that I would use to describe it. So I have kind of a complicated situation. I have a 4.5-year-old little girl. So I feel like she's a little young to really have a full understanding of what exactly is going on, but a lot of big emotions. And then I also have a 19-year-old stepchild who really is very close to me, more so than her dad. And so she's been in the middle of this a lot too. So I'm kind of getting both the older child and the younger child emotions, conversations, and it's been difficult.
Yeah, I could certainly appreciate that.
So, Dr. Marc, that's a lot to unpack there. When you think about such a small child and a 19-year-old stepchild, that's a lot of dynamics and big feelings. What are your thoughts on that?
I guess the first question I'd have for you is, how do the 19-year-old and the 4.5-year-old get along?
They are the best of friends. Even though they're 14 years apart, they're both girls, they're sisters. They are very close with each other. And in fact, again, a very interesting situation. The 19-year-old was raised in Wyoming where her mom and stepdad live. But when it came time to go to college, she chose to come to the university where I live to be close to me. I have a bedroom in my house for her, and she spends almost every weekend with me and the little one. And so we have a very close-knit relationship.
So could I ask you, what concerns did you have about the divorce and its impact on the kids at the time you were considering it? What came to mind? What were you worried about?
Well, truthfully, I'm a child from a divorced home. And so, my whole life growing up, I really never wanted to be in this situation where I was divorced with children because I knew how it felt to be the child in that situation. And as a child, I looked at all of my friends whose parents were still married and saw this very normal family and how mine was complicated and messy. And I never wanted that for a child. So here I find myself in that situation now. And I guess what I don't want for my child more than anything is for them to feel like they are in the middle of things, that they have to make decisions, that they are caught up in drama between the parents. That's what concerns me the most. I think we've gotten to a place in society where, more and more people are divorced. And so parenting time and changing it seems more common now to maybe have parents that are divorced than when I was a child. So that's not as much like societal pressure, but I'm concerned about the dynamics between myself and the other parent, primarily.
Okay. Right. And about how far into the process are you?
Very far.
Very far.
We've been separated for 2 years, and I filed for divorce 18 months ago, but we have a very complicated situation with our relationship, so it's ongoing, unfortunately.
Okay. And how much time does the 4.5-year-old spend with the other parent?
Right now, it's really limited. For a good chunk of time, it was supervised visitation only on a few hours a week. And now we're to unsupervised, no overnights, a few hours a week. But a big challenge is the other parent doesn't always prioritize the time. So it's really hit or miss in terms of how often, frequent, yes, there are set days and times, but like how often that's actually happening within that
Right.
schedule, if that makes sense. So it's
Oh,
very
yeah.
minimal still.
It's minimal. So that poses some huge challenges for the 4.5-year-old because there's an issue about time and how 4.5-year-old looks at the world and how you create and stage a contact. How you build anticipation, particularly if the visit doesn't go through. Child is expecting to see dad and dad doesn't show, or the visit doesn't take place, or the visit doesn't go well. That adds to the complexity for certain. How have you managed that with the 4.5-year-old?
To be honest, I think I'm getting better with it. I do therapy myself regularly. And so it's a topic I talk to my therapist about, and what she has encouraged me to do and what I have found to be the most helpful is to just be honest and to be straightforward about what is happening, and also to encourage my child to talk to me about how she feels. So I ask her very open-ended questions and encourage her to tell me what she's thinking, how she's feeling, and then to respond appropriately to that so that I am supporting her and meeting her where she is.
When you ask those questions and how she's doing and how she's feeling, what's going on in your mind when you ask those questions? What are your fears and thoughts when you ask those questions?
Well, for anyone who's ever had a child at 4.5 years old, you just really never know what's going to come out of their mouth at any moment. So the fear is that she's going to respond in a way that I don't know how to answer the question, or I don't know if I should be honest or how honest to the question that she's asking. So every time I ask her a question, I think I'm there to support, but I'm also like waiting with bated breath and not sure what exactly she's going to respond with and then what my response is going to be. And for someone like me who likes to be as prepared as possible for things, that's really challenging.
And Dr. Mark, when you hear fears and thoughts, I'm sure people listening have had similar ones. What's your advice?
I think the best advice is to do more of what you're doing, but also be very mindful of your response. So a 4.5-year-old who's very attentive and also quite attached to you is going to be reading you for every sign and signal of your discomfort. So if you're distressed, your 4.5-year-old will read it, even if they don't know how to explain that. So one of the things is to be measured, certainly in your tone, to always be reassuring, to always be comforting, and when you can, provide choices and options to her about what she can do with her feelings. And part of it is the inquiry is because she's still at the age where you're trying to help her label how she feels. 4.5-year-olds don't often know the distinction between emotions. So it's important to do what you do as a parent. It really doesn't have to do with the divorce of the situation. You're trying to teach her a language of emotion, how to describe how she feels. Does it feel like this or does it feel like that? Providing those kinds of options and doing that pretty routinely, I think is very effective for a child under 5. If a child that way at that age is going to relate in terms of what is predictable, what feels safe, the issue about environmental cues is really critical. And it's the environment that you provide, which I'm sure is a safe and protected one. But you're not sure that she's going to a safe and protected environment when she goes to dad. Would that be accurate?
That's true.
Okay. So managing your anxiety about that and being encouraging when you're unsure, I think is one of the hardest things for a parent to do. Your child is looking to you for cues to explain to herself whether she'll be okay or not. And when you're sending her on a visit with somebody that you don't know will follow through or will be attentive enough to her, will notice when she's upset and then respond appropriately to the upset, with somebody who may not know how to soothe her or redirect her when she gets stuck in her play, that's a concern. That's very, very difficult. So some of that issue has to do with managing the separations, how she separates from you, how you set the stage for a visit, and how you get her back after a visit, and how you create that safe space for her again to sometimes regress. She may want to be quiet. She may not be open to talking. She may be the kind of kid who needs some quiet time, a snack. And even if you may not be big into giving your kid TV or screen time, that may be a good time to do some TV or screen time, just so she can resettle and reacclimate. And it sounds like from your relationship with her is a very close one, she's going to want to share with you what's happened. And again, she's going to be looking at you for signs and signals that you're anxious and you're waiting with anticipation for her to tell you something. What has she said to you that has surprised you in some way, positively or negatively?
Well, she's really smart, and I attribute that to the fact that she's basically around adults all the time other than going to daycare and preschool. She has a huge vocabulary, unlike any 4-year-old I've ever met. So, the other night I asked her how she was feeling and she said, "I'm really frustrated." And I've never heard her use that word before.
Yes.
So, I wanted to find out, was that really how she was feeling? Like you mentioned, is that really frustration? Is that how you're feeling? And it was.
Mhm.
And, she said to me, "I don't understand why he doesn't show up to see me."
Yes.
And I thought, wow, for 4 years old, for you to already recognize that and feel frustrated by that's hard. It's really hard. She feels disappointed and she's questioning herself. And, she's very young to be going through that.
Right. So that's a tough one. So as a parent, is your inclination to try to make an excuse for her dad or to try to smooth that over in such a way as to reinforce the fact that he's around? Or is it to be more focused on her being unsettled by the emotion?
Truthfully, the first previously, I would always try to come up with a reason and I would say, I guess, like, protect him in her eyes, right? But again, through therapy and just walking through this situation, now I really just try to stay focused on her. And again, I'm honest with her and I just try to help her sort out her feelings. So in that instance, I would say, you know, "You feel frustrated. Can you tell me why you feel frustrated?" "Okay, well, I'm sorry you feel that way," and I reassure her that I love her. I'm always there for her. I love spending time with her, and not in a way to, throw the other parent under the bus by any means, but just to make sure that she understands that she has a safe and loving home and that she can be honest about her feelings with me always.
That's great. And I'm sure she's sounds like the kind of kid who's very responsive to that way of interacting with her. So you're validating how she feels without telling her how she should feel. And you're not giving her an interpretation just to soothe her, which she will now know to be untrue. I mean, so she's had some history of dad not showing. And that's part of her frustration, that he does not prioritize her.
Dr. Mark, I'm sure there are a lot of people listening who would intuitively want to go to protecting the child and protecting the feelings of that, of how they feel about an abandoned parent. What would you say to anybody who is thinking those same things?
Right. See, I think it's the natural inclination to want to protect the child by making excuses for the other parent. Now, we don't need to get into the details about why it's not showing. To me, quite frankly, I'm a parent, I'm a grandparent. It's incomprehensible to me that people would not want to make a priority out of seeing their child. I've been doing this for decades. It continues to amaze me that some people come up with excuse after excuse. When you have a young child who is needing that kind of contact in order to facilitate an effective emotional bond, and you're the parent who repeatedly interrupts the bond, eventually you create a set of difficulties for a child. You're leaving the child either having to idealize the absent parent, which also leads a child to sometimes thinking they're responsible for the parent not showing up for them. So it must be something they're doing, they start to think. That's a possibility. Another is to want to rush in as a parent and kind of save the child from the conflict. And that's a natural thing to want to do, but there are not a lot of solutions you can give. The one that you're doing is actually the best, which is to be reassuring, and this is what we have, and when you're here with me now in this space, this is what is predictable, this is what we can do. And you don't make efforts to explain away or nullify the child's experience of the abandonment. She's getting to it. She should be in therapy with doing some play therapy. That would be helpful. And at some point, maybe a therapist could reach out to your ex and try to explain how this abruption in contact is not a good thing for the child's development. I mean, one of the myths that we talk about is that divorce is always bad and the long-term effects are always dreadful for a child. Unfortunately, you're in a situation which is not desirable. In order for a child to make a move through this, parents need to show up and reaffirm their commitment to the child by being present. It's nothing like it. The absence of that presence is something that creates this notion that they can be left, that they're unimportant. And it's really hard for the child to reconcile, particularly when they have a point of comparison. They have another parent who shows up all the time. It's kind of easy for you to show up for your daughter, is it not? I mean, it's the easiest thing.
Absolutely.
So she has this point of comparison, and she's a really bright kid. So there's no way to really make sense out of that other than to explain what it is that you do when you have the time together and to validate her feelings and to help her give voice to those feelings. You may see some of that in her play, by the way. It could be how she plays with figurines. It may be in how she draws, maybe in what she sings. But you'll see elements of these issues and this kind of personal drama in her play. Over the long term, the issue about predictability and the absence of conflict or reduced conflict is the thing that leads to best outcomes. When children are exposed to continual conflict, they don't do as well long term. But a lot of that is in terms of how you manage it. So if you're rational and reasonable, empathic, accurate with your empathy, by that I mean really understanding the message that she's giving you, what she's speaking, what she's not speaking, the overt and covert messaging, and you create that and are able to redirect her to things that encourage and support her own growth, her own creativity. 4.5 is a great age. I mean, kids are just, their imagination is boundless. To the extent she can do that with you, and you could do that in the context of play and opportunity, she'll be just fine long term. The issue about whether or not he shows up is going to reach a crescendo point, I would say probably in the next 2 years, because he's either going to show up and have a relationship, or your very wise and insightful 4.5-year-old will start asserting herself. And she may start showing some refuse and resist kind of dynamics, not because you're telling her not to go, but because she is understanding this issue about allegiance. As she moves closer to age 7, most 7-year-olds are know-it-alls. I mean, they know everything. They're kind of hard for you to, they're rough that way, but also wonderful. A 7-year-old's moral compass is very rigid. Just a developmental thing. They kind of grow out of that. But precocious kids kind of get to that stage earlier. So this notion about right and wrong will become apparent to her. She's also looking at her 19-year-old sister, who has now also made a decision to gravitate to you, which is more affirmation that you're the parent of record. You're the emotional parent here. So that also sets the stage for the 4.5-year-old to interpret what's happening here. So the 19-year-old's coming to stay with you. 4.5-year-old is looking at her dad going, well, what's the problem here? What's the problem?
I'm curious, could you talk a little bit about what were your fears in initiating your divorce? And did those fears subside? And did you get to a point where you thought this was the even better solution?
Yeah, that's a fair question. To be honest, and this is me being very transparent about my life, I think one of my reasons for not coming to the conclusion of divorce sooner is just based on my past history. I was married also when I was very young, and that marriage, it ended amicably, but it ended. And when I was younger, also very religious. So I really didn't believe in divorce and didn't ever want to be divorced. And here I was, one divorce under my belt, now married again. And hey, it's not working. There's some really bad things that were happening in the relationship. So I think that that was one of the reasons that I held on for so long, was maybe just a little bit of shame, fear of judgment. And then, now having a child was also just the fear of the unknown in terms of child custody sharing and the back and the forth, and would this be the right move for her, and really worried about all of that. But I will say that in the end, one of the biggest reasons why I decided to leave and to file divorce was because as I watched my little girl get older and I watched my stepdaughter get older, and I realized that they were watching this very toxic relationship in front of them, that I was doing them a complete disservice by remaining in that relationship. And, I again grew up in a divorced home. My dad was very physically abusive to my mom, and I saw that firsthand when I was a little girl, and it affected my relationship with him, it affected all my relationships in my life. And I thought, man, as much as I wanted to maintain this, standard family dynamic, parents are still married with the kids, I'm not showing them what a good, healthy relationship looks like. I'm not showing them as a female, that it's okay to say, this is not an appropriate relationship and I'm not going to be in this. And the best thing that I can do for the two of them, especially as girls, is to show them that this is not okay. And that even though it's going to be hard to go on my own, I can do it. In the end, we're all going to be happier and healthier because of it.
I'd like to follow up on that. What you say really has a great deal of wisdom, and I'm glad you were able to work yourself through this process to get to here. Here's the question. How has your parenting been transformed by being a single parent apart from that partner? And how have you been able to access your own strengths that you couldn't show as much when you were together and still coupled?
I think in general, as human beings, we don't always necessarily understand our full potential to handle things. And in this experience, I feel that I have really, in a lot of ways, been forced to step up and be the primary parent, the primary caregiver, financially, physically, emotionally. And, maybe before I might have had some fears that I couldn't do it on my own, or she wouldn't get everything she needed if it was just me. But I have realized that I am incredibly resilient. I'm able to do things I didn't think I was able to do. And not only are we living a happier, healthier life, we have a very peaceful home. This is our sanctuary, her and I. And I have shown her that no matter what, you can do it all. I work full time, I take care of her full time. And, I'm doing all of it, and we're happy and we're healthy, and it's okay.
Wonderful and good for you. That's spectacular to hear. So, one of the things that I think gets underestimated and overlooked is the issue about resilience and what you can be. And you don't know what that's going to look like until you actually separate. The other is the real main point, I think, here, which is that in the act of moving on and doing so in the manner in which you did, you were able to reduce the amount of conflict on the girls. markedly. And the reduction in that conflict is so beneficial to their well-being to have a place that you can use the word sanctuary. I love hearing people use that word. When home can be sanctuary, the kids can relax. They can't relax when there's a lot of conflict in the home. And the conflict in the home doesn't need to be screaming and shouting and carrying on. The conflict in the home could be tension that is covert but palpable. And it's true, both girls are seeing that. Then you get to the issue about modeling. Being a woman, what are you modeling in terms of self-efficacy? Modeling in terms of self-care. You want the girls to be able to choose relationships where they're honored and respected, where there is an actual partnership where both parents pitch in and help, where they do it without fanfare, where they do it without making faces and grimacing. And if you can model that for them as a single parent alone for a time, it makes it much easier for the future when you'll probably be recoupled because they will have better confidence in your ability to find somebody who will also honor you and help create that sanctuary for them and perpetuate it. I think the 19-year-old is at a different place here. She's really got to be, if she made the choice to come with you, this is really monumental in terms of her choice for herself. And she must be feeling such sadness that she's had to work through to get to this place. So watching you and interacting with you around your sadness and seeing you move through it is very encouraging to her. That's quite wonderful, actually.
I'd like to interject a little question. When you talked about what your 4.5-year-old was going through with when the parent doesn't show up, how does that make your 19-year-old feel? And what has she expressed?
Yeah, this is tough. In a lot of ways, I think it's very triggering to the 19-year-old. She grew up with this person as her father, who also she had a very limited relationship with. He was in the military, so he wasn't always around to see her. And when she did have time with him, in her opinion, it wasn't really focused on her. So she grew up with her own challenges with him. And now seeing her little sister, who she loves more than anything in the world, go through the same or very similar with the same human being, I think it's very triggering for her to relive that. I think in a lot of ways she's been able to be a great support to the 4-year-old and, really just be there for her. But I also can see how this is digging up some of those past emotions. And frankly, she is, I brag on both of them because I'm the mom in this situation and I think they're the greatest kids in the world. But my 19-year-old is the smartest, most mature 19-year-old I've ever met in my entire life. And the decisions that she has made towards her father and the decision to, for now, not have a relationship with him, she's gone completely no contact with him. And the words that she's used to express that to him are so intelligent, emotionally intelligent, so mature. I'm so proud of her, of where she's come and the decisions that she's made. And obviously I support her through anything, but I do know that there's still a world of hurt there because in a perfect world, who doesn't want to have a relationship with their parent? Everybody does. Everybody wants to be close to their parent, have a good relationship. So it's
And
hard.
I think that that's a great segue into one of the topics Dr. Mark has talked about is having the talk. When you think about having the talk, when you had to first tell your girls that you were going to initiate a divorce, what was going through your mind? Because I know that it had to be completely different for the 4.5-year-old and your 19-year-old, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. So at the time, my 4-year-old was 2. And initially, we had moved across the country with the expectation that dad would join us once he retired from the military. So we lived on our own already. So that was actually very, I think, easy with her because she was 2, she was young. And at that time, for the last year, she'd really only known it was me and her the entire time anyway. So it wasn't much of an adjustment for her. The 19-year-old, honestly, that conversation scared me more than anything else. And I think it's because I had been in her life since she was 11 years old, and I love her so much. We are so close. I was scared that it could impact the relationship. I was afraid that maybe we would no longer have a relationship anymore. And I was also afraid, to be honest with you, to face the truth of what had happened that she had experienced, right? So there were many times that she had been around before the 4-year-old was ever even born, where there were really bad, high conflict arguments, toxic things that happened in our relationship that she witnessed firsthand that were always very, very bad and very embarrassing, frankly. And in some ways, I was afraid to have to admit that finally I was leaving the relationship. And I can't express to you the relief that I experienced from her in that moment. It was like I told her what was going on, and the first words out of her mouth were, "Thank God."
Right. So I take it you weren't aware of what she was seeing and what she was feeling and how she was processing the conflict she was experiencing.
I think I wasn't aware of how much it impacted her.
Yes.
And not because, I think I'm a very smart person, but I think I was dealing with my own trauma for so long with the relationship with him that I couldn't even begin to think about how it was impacting her. But then when I had my little one around all the time, because the 19-year-old would only come out for the summers and holidays and, it was infrequent visits. But then when I had the little one around all the time, that's when I realized, oh my gosh, this is impacting them just like I was impacted as a child from my parents, the things that my dad did to my mom. And what may have been acceptable for me to put up with or try to work through is not acceptable for them. And I have to make that choice for them to give them peace and happiness. And I think my stepdaughter wished that for the longest time.
Thanks for joining us. It would be really cool if you could spread the word. You know someone who could use this? Well, don't forget to subscribe and leave a review, but also share more with somebody about our mission to help co-parents feel less alone. Please share this podcast freely. For more tips and tools about how to navigate this time, please go to makesenseofthemess.com.